Thank you, everyone. You can hear me. Okay. Just checking. Thank you, Karla, for coming. I'm so excited to have you here. A little backstory, maybe in like 2019, I found Karla's Instagram, and that's how I just fell in love with everything that she was doing from like a social practice standpoint. It's so important. I'm not obviously Salvadorian, but I truly, truly am moved by the work you do, and I feel like I can learn so much from you. And so I'm so happy that you tapped me to be a part of the conversation, so thank you.
Well, Krystal also DM'd me and
said,
she slid into the DMs during pre-orders,
yeah,
I think.
pre-orders.
It's like, are you coming to Baltimore? The Salvi community presente is ready. And we couldn't make it work for the tour, but then Courtney reached out to me, and it's like you two were already colliding, working together on it.
Magic meant to happen.
Yeah.
So thank you for this, and thank you for this gift of a book. For me, it was very emotional. It was a very moving, touching book. It's more than a cookbook. It really is, to me, almost kind of like a time capsule for these women's narratives. And I wonder, was there something, I know in the beginning of the book you mentioned that, you know, the person that you were when you arrived to this work is not the person that you were when you left. Mm-hmm. Is there something, I guess, in particular that you learned in this entire process that really shaped your relationship to your identity on a personal level, but also your relationship with others in the diaspora?
Wow, we are starting with the heavy hitters.
Oh, sorry, girl.
I love it. Now let's get into it. Okay. Immediately, I think, so there's this, you hear it, especially during Hispanic Heritage Month, there's this kind of messaging that says, you know, we're kids that had parents who told us a lot about the homeland, but we're also being raised in the U.S. and trying to acclimate, assimilate, maybe survive. And so you start to develop, you hear this messaging of ni de aquí, ni de allá. And that's kind of how I started the beginning of this, feeling like I don't belong here, I don't belong over there. And I think where I landed, you know, 9 years deep into this work, where I've landed now is on the counter of that. De aquí y de allá. From here and I'm from over there.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't have to let a border get in between what is mine. The border's man-made. It's imaginative, you know. Yeah. It is a physical border, but it doesn't have to, I don't have to accept that as far as how I construct my own identity. Yeah. And that's kind of been very freeing. It also means like, oh shit, if it's an election year, sorry, if we're not, I know it's being recorded, but that was a very true reaction to, you know, trying to figure out and process and unpack what does it mean to be de aquí y de allá. It was an election year in El Salvador this year. I don't know how much y'all keep up with the elections in Central America, but there's always something going on, and this one was no different. It was, it's a scary time, I'll say. It's an election year here too, and so it's like double the policies that I'm trying to kind of keep my head afloat in this ocean of information, and always feeling like I'll never know enough. I'll never remember the definitions to this Spanish thing. You know, I feel like part of the thing that people connect with this is that I've tried to be as honest as possible. Yes. And my truth is that I will always have more questions, which means I will always kind of show up with a sense of insecurity because I'm trying to satisfy this sense of inquiry, you know. Yeah. I come from a place, what does it look like? What does it look like at 3 p.m. on a Friday? What are people doing? Do they feel tired? I know what it looks like in LA. I know that my working class neighborhood is going through it, you know. I know when the neighbor's mad at her husband because the music she plays is like, don't.
Right,
you know,
right.
You sense the vibe, you know. So I think that I feel very fortunate that this whole perception of, oh, I don't belong here, I don't belong there. I think that's, who does it benefit to believe that?
Exactly.
Certainly not me.
Yeah.
And so I would say that's been one facet. And also to say that the same way that borders shouldn't get in the way, I also feel that nationalities, and yes, I was born in El Salvador, all of those things can be so complex. And the truth of it is also you belong to yourself first, and you should still choose who you want to be. And do you want to be someone who holds two languages in how they express themselves? Okay, great. You don't have to feel bad that you didn't learn it when you were 5. Anything you know, you didn't know before, right? And anything you're good at, it just means you kept doing it.
Yeah.
And so little things like that that just kind of became, I see the world different.
No, I mean, I think that's really apparent in the book. There was a recipe, I think it was frijoles con soya.
Yes.
Which I was like, what? It had a Japanese influence to it. And you talked about the complexities and nuances, and that really touches on the complexities and nuances of just being part of a diaspora, period, you know, obviously, especially from a Salvi perspective, but just as a world of people with a history of migration. Like, you know, I think we all have to understand that we truly do have an ancestry of migration. We weren't originally in the place that we were, with the exception of folks who have been largely oppressed, especially in this country. But I think when you think about the complexities and the nuances, you know, a Japanese influence, a French influence, what were the ones that were the most like mind-blowing for you? Like that was in the book, but I know that through this project you've connected with folks from like France and like maybe even Germany, all over the globe. So like, is there something that you were just like, I didn't even think that that was possible? Like, you blew my mind. Like, we everywhere, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there was someone who messaged me from Abu Dhabi, and she was saying like, you know, there's not a lot of masa for tortillas out here. And I'm like, yeah, I wouldn't expect there to be. But you know, she would still send me the photos of pupusas in Abu Dhabi. That was just so exciting. There is a pupusera in Japan, and she does an omakase. I know. And she does an omakase of Salvadoran Japanese kind of, I wouldn't call it a fusion. I think.
And why wouldn't you call it a fusion?
I feel like a fusion sometimes, well, if you think of when we use the word, there's a sort of inherent force.
Because you are fusing.
Yeah, like you think of bones, like immediately it feels, it's violent, right?
It is, yeah.
And so fusion, I feel like, I hear my mother's words, lo estás forzando, you're forcing it, you know. You're trying to, maybe some people might call it a gimmick, right? Fusion. I don't know that I have a word to describe this observation I'm seeing with people who are migrating everywhere, like we're talking. And, you know, they want to find pieces of home, but you have the pantry you have, right? Cuisine is first and foremost regional. You can't eat what doesn't grow around you. You know that. Yeah. We eat what we can reach for, right? And so I also believe that, you know, recipes in some ways are like addresses. You know, like every recipe in this cookbook, I know if I'm cooking it, you know, I'll know who I think of. I can't ever lose my mom no matter what happens to us when we go into the moor, because I have a way to reach her every single time with her recipe. And she has so many, but one of the ones I love is pollo con aceitunas. It's chicken and olive dish. And so I think there's a push and pull there of, I want this address. I want to get to that place, to this person, but I live in Japan, you know, like, but I live in Abu Dhabi. I think we might be cheating ourselves from the depth of what that is, the meaning of what that is, if we just call it fusion.
Yeah. It also sounds like when you're describing it as an address, and then also someone wanting a connection, it almost feels like an anchor. of sorts. You know, you're kind of like getting blown around and like
Yeah.
the domination of the world and everything that's happening around you. You're just trying to survive. But then if you have that one thing that is your culture that can kind of anchor you in the reality of like where you are and who you are, it really kind of keeps you steady.
Yes.
If that makes any sense.
Yes.
I think about that when I look at your work a lot too, because it feels like, just as a woman in food, it feels as though you really tapped into the women, like the rich relationships that you have with other women in your life and how they have been your anchor. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because it's really throughout this book, I know some of you have probably read it and maybe you haven't, but the stories of these women and their experiences, it's been so like, I teared up a few times reading these stories. The story about your grandmother and her passing, you know, so many beautiful and honest experiences. Talk about the relationships, those rich relationships you have with women in your family and in the community as well.
Yeah, okay, so when I started this project, I was in my late 20s, and I'd always felt insecure in everything that had to do with El Salvador. I lamented, I would keep track of the percentage of time I spoke English versus Spanish. And I'd be like, oh man, today was like a 90% English day, like, whew, that's gonna bite me in the ass later, you know. Or, you know, we speak Spanish, but we also speak Salvadoran Spanish, which is called caliche. Okay. And, other Latinos will sometimes choose to correct Salvadorans and say, oh, you're saying it wrong. Like, I'm not. But
if you know, you know.
Yeah, like you just told on yourself you don't have any friends from Central America. That's what that means. Okay. So I think that I always longed for answers. I wanted a balm to put on this wound that was like, we left home and I don't know how to, it's just an open wound and it's festering. And the only person that really gave me that was my grandmother, my Mama Lucy. And, you know, she was tender with me. And I think that can happen with grandparents. If you have immigrant parents, sometimes you can't come to them. You know, I wanted to find my mother's tender side, but I was never going to get it when I was a younger person. The way that she was surviving and the way I was surviving are different. And so that survival, those things kept us from each other. And so I couldn't go to her, but I could go to my grandmother. And I could say any question I had about what life was like in El Salvador, and my grandmother would, you know, fill it in. You know, she really added texture to this page, you know, this blank page I had in my head. And when my grandmother, or even when my mom shared stories, like, things were so vivid. I could hear the score. I could hear the cumbia at the marketplace. I could hear the trees. I could smell the ripening fruit on trees. You know, everything was just so extremely vivid that I realized that the way I could feel centered in myself was the women. They knew themselves. My grandmother was an excellent storyteller, and I always knew I wanted to be a writer. And my grandmother never had writer's block. She knew exactly what she was doing with the person listening to her story. She had them at the edge of her seat. She knew what she was doing. She knew the storytelling devices to get you to laugh, to get you to be like, oh, Salvi gasp, you know, like just, she knew it. And those were things that told me these women, whatever storms may come, they'll still be there. And I wanted that. I wanted to feel that. I didn't know how to do it, but I saw them in the kitchen. I saw them doing what they did. And I thought that it was so strong to say, I'm the person that cooks, and even though I'm hungry, I'm feeding everybody. And don't you dare wait for me, because then the food will get cold, and I will eat last, and you'll leave me alone. You know, I was like, wow.
This is my kitchen.
Yeah, like they were reinas de su casa, queens of their own castle. And So I think for me, this project was a lot about recipes and culture and touching home, but it was about unpacking my own womanhood, and then also realizing so much of women's labor, we are conditioned to not look at it. We're conditioned to say, oh, but that looks easy. I could do that.
Yeah.
And it's like, you could, but are you going to make it look as easy as I'm doing it? Because that's why I'm the expert, right?
Exactly.
Or that's why I'm the mom. That's why I'm the grandma,
Right.
right? That's why I'm the matriarch.
Exactly.
And those were all the things that I craved more than any pupusa in some ways. I really wanted that. And so this project had a lot to do with unpacking those layers of, will I feel Salvadoran in my 50s? Will I look like my grandmother when I'm 50? And I thought, no, what if my future is just being at Trader Joe's looking at pastas? I was really afraid. I was like, I think the chicken sausages are just forever, and we've all had that evening, I think. It's like, I'm too tired.
Yeah.
Bow tie pasta, where are you?
Right, exactly.
And that's okay. Like that's the great thing about the modern time we live in. We can be afforded conveniences that make women's lives, who are often the ones cooking food, making our lives easier, which is great. I also think that we crave more. And I also think that those cravings should be honored.
Yeah. Sorry, I was like, that was such a... I mean, it is true. And I think about when you were saying, like, the Trader Joe's thing, even like starting there, but then backtracking a bit, like you mentioned in the book, we were talking about convenience, cobitos, right?
Yeah.
Or bouillon cubes or Knorr powder, whatever, using that, and the shame that a lot of people have tied to using that, when that's one, like, no one has time to sit for hours and make a stock.
Yeah.
Like, no one has time for that, especially if you're a mom with kids who's working another job and another job. Like, you getting up in the morning, getting them ready for school, or even coming home late at night, helping them with homework. You just don't have time. And so it almost feels like in the system that we live in, you are robbed of your identity over and over. You're robbed of your womanhood. You're robbed of being Salvi. You're robbed of all these things that you truly have no control over, because this is how you're surviving in capitalism. And it's really beautiful that you've really kind of laid out examples of ways that it's okay. It's okay to be surviving in this way. Like, you are staying intact. You're not letting someone else determine your identity. You're still retaining that anchor or that relationship to your culture. And I just wonder, when you were writing some of these things, there's when you're publishing a book, there's a recipe testing aspect to it, Did you have any pushback from the recipe testers or the publishers or anyone else as far as like, Cubito, do you have like an authentic stock from Salvador? Like, or this doesn't feel like you're using white bread. Like, what about torta rolls? You know, like that kind of thing, and just trying to have that, that pushback there.
Of course, the pushback. What flavor do you want? Like there were different kinds of pushback, and so for instance, with the cubito, the bouillon cubes, right? There was a lot of shame that some of the women, when I was there to cook with them, they'd often say like, oh, well, I guess I don't know how to cook if I rely on this. And I'm like, oh, no. And sometimes it wasn't even my job to try to shake them out of this myth that we've all just, it comes at us so much, because then that's scrutinizing how they do life. And I just never my place was never to take anything from them. And in some ways, some people will say, oh, it's so great that you've brought these women into this book. I'm like, no. Let me clarify. They're bringing me on. What can I teach? They're teaching me. They're passing on that knowledge. So I always came in wanting to offer a listening ear, you know, just hear what they had to say and observe. And so when it came to things like uvito, yeah, that they were ashamed of using it. And, you know, and I would talk to them like, well, but how much time do you have to make food? Exactly. How much time? And they're like, oh, well, we get here, you know, from home, from work, I mean, and from school, and I have about 40 minutes to get everything, because then we have to do schoolwork or, you know, however your evening goes. And I thought it was so vulnerable for them to share an insecurity, because often that's the first thing that you hide, right? You want to front, especially in the food world right now. Everybody's like, oh, I know how to use I don't know, whatever machine is in vogue right now. I know for a while it was that sous vide machine.
Oh, right.
And it's like every menu was like sous vide fish. And,
True.
And it's like, it's not, I don't know, I think I have just always admired women, and the women in my family have just taught me a certain amount of grit. And the grit is, you can't be taught that grit. And in some ways that was what kept us apart, right? From these, having these tender, loving mother and daughter relationships. I was expected to learn grit. I was expected to live my life, like put some skin in the game. You don't know how to do this? Go learn it, you know? We didn't know English. We learned it, you know? At the same time, the other side of that coin, there was this like really like chip on my shoulder kind of thing, you know, that, you know, certain generations may have. And so, yeah, I think there was just so much, and I only ever wanted to add to them. I wanted to give them a platform. I wanted them to experience having their own agency. When I would go and ask them for their stories, there'd be times where some of their adult children would say, Karla, ask about how they crossed the border, you know. Cómo cruzaron la frontera is a great story. There's action, there's this, there was a, there was just all kinds of things. There's a story that you're just gonna love. And so I was like, okay, thank you for the tip, I will go in. So I would have my meeting, or, you know, my conversation with them, and I would start asking one of the señoras, and quickly, very quickly, learned that those are stories for family. They are not for even a well-intentioned young person who's wanting to, you know, preserve this spirit, this person and how they lived life. And, you know, there's an ethics to it. Even if this story would benefit all of us in this room, if it harms the storyteller, it's not worth it, you know. The story belongs first to the storyteller. And if they see that they are safe emotionally, psychologically, then they'll share it. And so the stories that are in the book are stories that I stopped asking for leads, and the stories are the ones that, of their own agency, they shared with me. Did I answer your question?
You did.
Okay.
You did. No, you did.
We went to a few places.
No, you did. And the thing that stuck out to me was like, I guess like a dignified curiosity, if that makes any sense. I think, you know, especially in a lot of like food journalism or, you know, food media, so to speak, I think there's a lot of sensationalism and a lot of exploitation around food narratives, especially of this nature, that kind of touch on, you know, trauma or violence that happens when you are a woman, when you are a migrant. And I think that, you know, the way that you handled it was with such care, and also just the book to me in itself just felt like an invitation. And with an invitation, you know, you are a guest. And for me, as I was reading it, I loved, and I mentioned this to you earlier, I loved the limited use of the explanatory comma. Like, there were times when it was like in Spanish and it was like, figure it out. Which I was like, okay, all right, I will. Like, I don't speak Spanish. Sorry, y'all, I don't speak Spanish. But, you know, there were times where it was like, oh, in translation in English, But then there were times where it's like, I'm not translating this. Like, it's a part of the invitation is also saying to the person that's reading this, all right, if you really want to honor this story, if you really want to honor what you are reading right now, you now need to do the work. We live in a time where media is just so easily fed to everyone. And sometimes that's how we get into that misinformation, disinformation. But the thing about this was it was so honest. It was like, I'm not going to dress it up for an American audience. I'm not going to dress it up so that you feel better about what you're reading. It's like, this is just the truth of the matter. And I thought that was beautiful.
Thank you. You know, something that I didn't think twice about it, but there's been a few folks that have said, oh, Karla, thank you so much that all of the recipe titles are in Spanish. And I was like, but of course, and then I went to, you know, Barnes and Noble, started looking through some other Latin American cookbooks, and there is like the parentheses, you know, of like, this is what it's called. Sometimes it's in English, the proper name of the title is in English, and then the actual name it's called is in parentheses.
You're right, it is like that.
And the thing is, like, we already do that with acceptable things that have become part of the lexicon that we all use. Like, I had this example in our cooking class we had earlier, but something like omelet. I bet you're all thinking of your favorite kind of omelet. The cheese, the protein, peppers, no tomato, yes on the onions, you know? Like, it's so ubiquitous. It has ubiquity.
Yes.
And a ubiquity is something that costs something, you know? We talk about Julia Childs. Everybody wanted to make her beef bourguignon. You know, I don't even know if I said it right, but I tried. You know, all of these different dishes that are, you know, we call pesto. That's an Italian word. It's not just a made-up word. It's an Italian word.
Exactly.
And so I couldn't call pupusas corn griddled filled cakes.
No.
You know, or curtido. Rellenos de whiskey, which to me is something I ate more than pupusas or anything else Salvadoran. That was like, that is home to me.
Yeah.
Rellenos de whiskey. I couldn't call them something else. Like, how would you even? It wouldn't even make sense in my head. Just because, also, I have so much respect for all of these other ingredients that we call them the people who created them. Could you imagine calling, I don't know, tequila something else? What would we call it? No, it's a name that was chosen by the people who cultivate that ingredient and make this good. And that's respect, that's an exchange that you and I do. And I think that's what's exciting about a cookbook that you get to immerse yourself in.
And I think that's the thing that it's just so intentional. And again, I know like pushback on that was probably difficult. I think, especially since it's the first Salvadorian cookbook from a major U.S. publisher. Like, the thing that I love now is that having a little bit of an understanding of the book publishing landscape, a lot of times when you go to publish a book, they're like, okay, this is a great idea. Like, who would you say this book is like? Like, who has a book like this? Can you pick 3 books that are similar to like what you're trying to do? And we're gonna look at the numbers and see like if this should be published. And now we have a book for this. It just feels like you've opened up like you've broadened the road for so many folks, not just Salvi folks, but like so many folks to tell their story, their community story, their migration story. Because again, we all have a history of migration. And I wonder, this might be a big question, but like, I wonder if you've really had a moment yet to like grapple with the level of impact that you've had. Like, this really is, to me, which is why I wanted you to come here. Like, I was like, please come to Baltimore. It's so powerful because no one is really You know, even something as little, which is not little, as having a Spanish language name for a recipe, which again, I didn't think about that until you mentioned it. And I was like, as you said, of course it's going to be in Spanish. But you are 100% correct. When it's Mandarin, it's in Mandarin in parentheses. It is in, you know, French. French. Your Eurocentric recipes get to exist as they are.
Yeah.
But everybody else just got to play the game.
Yeah.
And you were like, no, we're not doing that. And so to me, again, it's just like, girl, do you know what you've done? Do you know? I don't think you know. I hope you know. You've done something very powerful.
Honestly,
Truly.
thank you so much
You
for
have.
saying that. I think this book started with my grandmother. And I lost her throughout the process of this project. And there was a long period of time where I felt like I cannot climb this emotional mountain. Not to mention, I made every mistake in the book as far as like digital archiving.
Oh, no.
There were some files that got lost. I didn't renew my Dropbox, like everything. Like it's just terrible. All of my interviews were on 4 different hard drives. It was just a mess. I was so in and over my head, and I didn't know how. Everything felt like it'll never be enough. I can't. A friend told me, Karla, people usually do projects and they unpack the things that they've lived, Essentially, every book is a story of what has happened to me. Maybe it's a memoir, a cookbook, a sci-fi. This is what's happened to me. This is how it's manifested in a story to be consumed. And they said, you are trying to unpack your mom's, what happened to her, your grandmother's, your great-grandmother's, and then you went on the internet and asked people to introduce you to their moms to then get their stories to see what happened to them. And they said, anyone would be feeling this way. Yeah. It was such a huge undertaking. And if my grandmother said something to me, I didn't have a name for this project when I was thinking of it. I had a craving for salpicón. It's a Salvadoran dish that is kind of like some people would describe it as a salad, but it's beef, it has mint, radishes, onion, and it's all minced, and it's served cold with frijoles, licuados, some pureed beans, and rice. It's delicious. And I had this craving, and I was just so frustrated that I didn't know how to make it. I was like, I've lived with family. Why don't I know how to make this? And so, I went to my grandmother, and she's like, oh, Karla, yo te ayudo. I'll help you. I'll put you on. I was like, okay, thank you, Malusi. And then I was so curious about this, and I told her, Malusi, what if I interview you a little more? Because she kept telling me stories of her life. And it was so cool because I was getting her point of view. Not my mom's, her daughter, not her outsider's point of view of her mother, as seeing her as someone who survived something. But when my Mama Lucy was sharing her story, she was the heroine of the story. She was a young Latina with a great hairdo in the 60s in El Salvador, and custom-made dresses because they only got 2, but she kept them up, and it was just like, she was fly, and I was like, wow, there's so much texture when she tells these stories. And, I really wanted to capture both the recipe and this great storytelling. And I wasn't sure if she kind of got what I was doing. So I said, Malusi, ¿me entiende? Do you get what this is? And she's like, Karla, claro que sí. She says, esto se trata del legado de la mujer salvadoreña. Which just translates to, of course, this is about the legacy of Salvadoran women. And this is, no, there it is. Oh. I was going to say this is the first time I didn't choke up saying it, but there it is. I think that was the point of no return whatever digital archiving mess I had gotten myself into.
You had to pull yourself out.
I had to pull myself out. Whatever grief I had to unpack, losing my grandmother, I had to pull myself out. Whatever no I got from an agent who said, where in Mexico is El Salvador? I had to pull myself out. There was just no point which I felt I can lay this down. It's done. And now it's crazy because the book is there and I'm like, oh my God, I can't even open it sometimes because in some ways it's a collection of decision making. It's a collection of emotional life in very raw state, you know. And it was, yeah, it took a lot. It did take a lot.
I mean, but I want to say you've done a beautiful job. I mean, you've held it so beautifully. And I feel, you know, man, this is really, especially in a time that we're in right now, like, you've it wasn't laid out like step one, here's how to do something similar. But you do in the book talk about like, hey, this is how I did it. This is how, you know, I have these more deep conversations with folks in the community. And I'm wondering, is there something in this process that, you know, we have a lot of conflict happening in the world right now with everything that, you know, that we as a country have our hand in many ways. And I wonder if there is something that you've kind of gleaned from this process and speaking with these matriarchs who have, you know, survived a civil war, survived leaving their homeland. I wonder if there's something you gleaned in the process of receiving these stories that you think is crucial for folks who are trying to preserve their culture in a migratory, like in the process of migration from outside forces of, you know, wherever they may be in the world. You know, thinking about displaced people and thinking about like the diaspora of Salvi culture, like you have Japan, and then you also talked about the woman in Abu Dhabi. The current president is half Palestinian of El Salvador. Like it's a lot of layers here. And I think, you know, we can look at El Salvador and Salvi culture as an example of diasporic nuance. And I think we can look at these stories as a way to preserve. But is there something that you gleaned in this process for how these people, like, how these women share, like, save their culture in a way and handed it to you?
I think one thing I'll tell you that some of these, 6 of the women in the book are related. I'm related to them. And then some are family friends, and then the others are women I met online. There was something that almost each of them said to me. Like, I have hours and hours. I've known some of them since 2015, like hours of interviews. But each of them, with some not knowing each other, at some point said this phrase, "Donde come uno, comen dos," which just means where one eats, 2 can also eat. And that felt in some ways like the definition of what I see as Salvadoran hospitality.
Yeah.
And that was the thing that I didn't realize, like, oh wait, this lady that, you know, had this happen and very different experience. She was a baker, but then she ended up in Orange County. And then this happened, like, has nothing to do with my grandmother, but my gosh, I heard my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my mom, my tia, everybody. At some point, they would even, you know, have fun with it. Oh, donde come 4, comen 6. Donde comen 6, comen 12. It was just constantly like, it just meant there's always room for somebody. We're always taking care of somebody, you know. And I thought that that was a beautiful, lasting legacy of what it meant to be a Salvadoran woman, what it meant to be a matriarch. I don't have children of my own. I am a matriarch still. A matriarch is the keeper of your stories, you know, of our stories, the keeper of our ways. Matriarchs are the people who, you know, when we stub our toe, if they say no jodas, then we say that because okay, that's what you do when this happens. Like they know to do certain things. They guard our rites of passage. They inform our day to day. We get answers, and that I think is what I've walked away with. Is I started with a lot of questions, and you know what? The good news is I have more. But that just means that we get to be answers for our community, because donde come uno, comen dos,
And that was, I see Courtney, sorry, I just want to say that was throughout the book. I really want to say how beautiful it was when you're thinking, I guess, as a Black American descendant from the Great Migration, second generation descendant, I often, especially living in a city like Baltimore, I really struggle with like a liberatory practice, like trying to find ways to be revolutionary in a small way, and especially in the arts, And in the arts, the industry itself, it kind of puts you in a place of competition. This is also true in food. There can only be one Salvadorian food person. There can only be one soul food person. But I think the thing that is really beautiful in this book that I kept reading throughout was, you mentioned Salvadorian hospitality. Under scarcity, under oppression, people were still sharing food. And I think one of the stories, all of the relatives were all tasked with little kids. All right, everybody, go out and grab, ask this neighbor if they have something. And each kid came back I got one egg. And this other person was I got a pepper. They all came together. And I think, was that your mom's story?
That's my great-grandmother's story.
Your great-grandmother's story. And she was saying, sometimes when we didn't know what we would eat, that's when we ate the best.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, imagination and generosity and interdependence, that's something that you really struggle to find in times of scarcity. Usually people are crabs in a barrel, but beautiful. Okay. And I think now we're gonna do a Q&A. So does anyone have any questions for Karla?
Well, first let's give a round of applause.
Oh, yes. So good.
Thank you both for your time, especially you, Karla. You were here with us. You flew in at 7:26 this morning, so you've been awake for a bit. Yeah, so a little bit of jet lag. If anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and I'll come over with the mic. Or you have a comment? No.
Both of you, thank you. I'm going to be sitting with this conversation for a while. So I think hearing you talk, Karla, obviously as an academic, I'm like, wow, you're just doing ethnography and it turns into this cookbook. This is so amazing. I think there's just so many ways to take on the project that you took, right? So storytelling, all the archive stuff, observation, just trying to be how do I gather these stories and tell them in a way that honors all of the things I'm trying to do. What brought you to, I haven't read it, so maybe you answer this. What brought you to doing it through food specifically? From all of the different ways you could have done this work, how did it end up in this way? And maybe a little bit of why that was important.
I honestly think it was never going to be anything other than food, because food is what hurt the most in some ways. I when you have a craving for something and you're just there is nothing that's going to get in the way of me getting this thing. And my family, we love during the holidays, the family chat is okay, you better bring this. You better bring that. And it's okay, you guys, relax. It's a time of joy, And I think we've always, let me put it this way. I think because of how we live, we've forgotten that food is first a survival tool, right? And that's always going to be hard. They make that joke about how couples 90% of the time is just you talking about where we're going to eat. Yeah. But I'm that is the history of humanity. It's literally why we're all here is because they kept having that conversation. You know, like the bison went that way. All right, I guess we're going that way. You know, and so, you know, I had a reporter asked me, "You write in the book that soups are events in your family, and in Salvadoran culture, like if you're doing a sopa de patas, a sopa de res, like everybody." You know, we're going to go to their house. And sometimes it was the person who had the smallest kitchen, the smallest living room, no AC, but you show up, right? And they're like, but a soup is just a soup, he said. He was a writer for Eater, I believe. And I said, well, I can understand your point of view, understand our point of view. A sopa takes lots of ingredients to make. You know, that means if you're invited to a sopa, that means that somebody got a payday. Somebody got access to all these different ingredients. And it's a party because there's abundance. And we're going to celebrate that, you know. And, you know, for a sopa de gallina, hen soup, my mom says that soup is sometimes the first food that they give to women who have just given a birth. And, you know, there's all these things like it means something. Food means something. And so to me, it's meant so many things. It's meant a connection to El Salvador, a place that is so small in this world, but it has represented some of the biggest questions I have about my life and who I am and what I'm here to do. And everything, you know. And so I think this story was always going to be with food at the very center. And then you go into, like, you know, the racial bias in publishing. And then you're like, well, of course there hasn't been a Salvadoran cookbook. And I got really scared when the election was happening and Trump was campaigning. He made a joke about El Salvador, and he said, you know, this country is so poor, I could purchase it. And like the feelings coursing through my body were visceral. And I thought, oh my gosh, like, can he do that? Like, I was trying to Google, like, can people purchase countries? You know,
They do it all the time. Kind of low key. They do it all the time.
Yeah. And so I thought, like, this is terrifying. And, you know, all of these things, like, I kept thinking, watch, if I don't do this, if I don't push my way through, watch there be now, because of all of the tourism happening in El Salvador, watch there be somebody who's, you know, from Madison, Wisconsin, who has a great surf camp and falls in love, and then watch some publisher greenlight her project because it's from her point of view, her probably being a white woman. And I've seen it, I don't have to think, I don't have to guess, historically this is what's happened. So those were all things that were very motivating. And, you know, the cherry on top is my grandmother saying what she said is, in some ways, I had no fight. You know, I was served. And, yeah, but thank you for your question.
Anybody else?
Hi, thank you so much for being here and telling us your story and the story of your family. I want to say it's a beautiful book, the stories you tell, the recipes. My family is Salvadoran, and it's been such a joy to share this with my family and the older generation. And they're always so happy to see the recipes that you added there. They'll say, like, oh, tortillas con leche, like she added that one too, right? And my question is, the cover is beautiful, truly an amazing book. I wanted to hear a bit about the process. What was the photography like, the pictures you took or that were taken of the recipes? You know, like there's spills, there's napkins, there's so much intentionality behind that, and I'd like to hear a bit about that.
Thank you so much. This is one of my favorite questions. So I had a bit of a spiral when I submitted my manuscript, because no one had explicitly told me that I had already worked on this project at that point for, I think, 7 years, and I have written my heart out. Like, I have left nothing on the table. I put it all out there, taking all kinds of feedback with the writing, and then I tested these recipes as best as I could, and then I realized, but the reason someone will pick it up will be the cover, which has everything to do with skill sets I don't have. And so that was just an intense feeling of like, you can work on something, get to know it so well, but the aesthetic, right? And when I started looking for my team, I wanted to work with people who were comfortable in creating something that there's no reference to necessarily. A lot of Latin books always end up skewing a little bit Mexican. And also, to be fair to Mexican aesthetics, there's so many different kinds of Mexican aesthetics, but they keep going to this particular kind of Mexican aesthetic. If they do something different, it'll be like Puerto Rican, kind of New Yorkino kind of vibe. And I really wanted to find people who knew how to collaborate. You know, one of the kind of rules I had in this journey was don't work with anyone who makes you feel like they're doing you a favor. And the people who I worked with were beside me. They were championing with me. And so Ren Fuller took all the food photos, and she's the one who took the cover. And this cover actually was not on our shot list. It was just kind of kismet. And one of the cool things that I learned was when I had my call with my team, my publisher, I said, I don't want pupusas on the cover. And they were immediately like, well, okay, like trying to, measure what they would say next. And then I was just so ready, like, I'm gonna fight, I'm ready. I got my talking points, my grandmother's spirit is with me, like I'm ready. And then the next question they asked me, I didn't expect. They said, well, what do you want on it? And I was like, oh, I don't know, I don't know. And I think sometimes as a person of color who's often, told that what we know is at the margins, should be at the margins, we're not ready for the question, well, what do you want? What does your creativity tell you? And so the best I could do with my visual team is I don't know what I want, but I know very well what I don't want. And from there, that was kind of the guiding star to figuring out what the aesthetic would be. And Nidia Cueva is the prop stylist, and she is one of 2 Salvadoran women who are prop stylists in this country. And she's great. Like people in New York, LA, she's always busy. And she was very helpful and instrumental because I would send her mood boards and she would say, tell me why you chose this blue spoon. I'm like, I think it's pretty, And she's like, okay, well, do you know that this blue is a Moroccan blue? I was like, oh, no. And so then I'd show her this blue, and then she would say, oh, well, this blue is more from Nayarit, Mexico. I was like, oh, shit, well, what kind of blue should I, and so it was a lot of questions, but Caroline Huang did the food styling, and she's the genius behind, I would tell her, I want things to feel lived in. I want my community to see it and be like, I can smell the coffee. It feels lived in, And Caroline Huang, who also is an immigrant herself, has, her 5th grade friend in LA was Salvadoran, so she had this context. So it was this team of women that got it so great. And finally, I will always sing the praises of Monica Torrento, who did the travel photography of El Salvador. Monica was the only woman photographer that we found doing this kind of photography. Everyone else who is a photographer in El Salvador was either doing photos of Bitcoin, of the violence, or of Surf City, because those are the three things that people care to photograph. And there was a softness, a stillness in Monica's photos that I felt like it did something in my nervous system. I was like, this is what I've been wanting to see. And that's a seasoned photographer's approach. And Monica was 24, 25 when she shot a lot of the photos in the book. So it's just an incredible team of women who are so good at what they do. And they championed it beside me. So it was a joy to put the visual aspects together.
You have time for one more question.
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever felt like you were gonna mess it up trying to make one of the foods in the cookbook?
This is my second favorite question. Yes, I was always scared, and let me tell you, there's a recipe that broke my spirit and my bank. And that is the pan de yema. Pan de yema is the bread that you make to make torrejas, which are normally eaten for Easter. And the pan de yema just did not want to rise. And, well, the way, there's so many different ways to make it, but the baker, the woman whose recipe it is Gabby, and she owns a panaderia in LA called Panaderia Cuscatleca. It's an iconic nook of Salvadoran culture in LA. And she said, come to the bakery and the master baker will talk you through the recipe. Great. I get the recipe, and she doesn't realize that she gave me a recipe for a bakery. So it said 50 pounds of flour, 2 ounces of yeast. Usually you do a little sprinkle of yeast, it's not 2 ounces. It was 10 pounds of eggs. I was like, Gabby, I don't know how to contextualize this for the home cook. And she's like, well, this is what you signed up for, And so that's why it literally broke my spirit, because I had to keep trying. And then I kept asking the master baker, are you sure you don't have rising time for this recipe? And he said, Karla, te lo digo que no. And he was just adamant, no. Finally, the light bulb went off when I realized he's saying no, but he doesn't realize he's not taking time into account that he's in a bakery where there's enormous ovens that are on for hours, and it's hot in there. And while he's prepping all of these other things, of course it's proofing and of course it's rising, but he just doesn't realize that. And in my kitchen, that was an even 70 degrees. So that was, I cried a lot. I cried. But it's there now, and I feel very, and I had him try it. I'm like, eh? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, all right. So it was great. Thank you for your question. That was a great one.
All right, let's give another round of applause.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to do the raffle for the book.
Oh, am I choosing this one?
You're going to
too?
choose it again.
Okay. Should I read or
I'll
you
read
can,
it.
okay,
Because it might be scribbled.
this person.
This one, okay. All right. We have Jonathan Chavez. He left.
Jonathan. Can you text him? Be like, do you?
Does anyone know?
Oh.
It might go home with you.
Jonathan might never see it. Do we want to pull another?
Should I do it again?
Do we want to pull?
Oh, wait, what did he love it? What did she say?
You have his email.
Jessica Pfeiffer has his email.
Anyone have his information?
Jessica has his.
Mouth is closed.
What do you think? Well, that's the thing. Students sometimes don't reply to emails right away.
The subject can be like, do you want this cookbook or no?
Yeah.
Somebody who's here.
Oh no.
I'm sorry, Jonathan.
Sorry, Jonathan.
Sorry, Jonathan.
Is this Aziza? Jonathan's loss is your gain.
Oh my gosh, thank you. Yeah,
Yes.
I'll definitely sign it. Yeah.
Before we finish, I just want to remind everyone, if you didn't grab it from the table, we have these bookmarks that has a coupon code. So if you do want to get a copy of the book, you can order it online from Charm City Books, and you'll get a 10% off discount if you use the coupon code. So once again, thank you all for joining us this evening.